Redemption Flats, Arizona, July. The desert wind moved through the open market like a slow breath across hot stone, lifting pale dust into the air and carrying it between rows of rough wooden stalls. Canvas roofs snapped softly above crates of beans, saddles, tools, and sun-faded bolts of cloth. The sun stood high and unforgiving. At midday in Arizona, light did not simply shine. It pressed down on everything like heated metal. Most people in the market had already retreated into the shade of wagons or the narrow shadows cast by buildings along the square. But one place remained crowded, a wooden auction platform beside the town well. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his neck with a handkerchief, lifted his hammer, and struck the block. The crack echoed sharply across the market. "Final lot," he announced, a reading from a paper held in his other hand. His voice carried easily over the murmuring crowd. "Labor contract, female, 26 years old, can cook, wash clothes, and work the fields." A short pause. "Starting price, $1. Dottie Marsh stood on the platform. For a few seconds, no one moved. The silence was not confusion. Everyone understood what was happening. In towns like Redemption Flats, labor contracts were sometimes sold when debts became too heavy, or families decided a relative was worth more as work than as kin. But something about this one held the crowd back. Perhaps it was the way the auctioneer described her, like a plow horse instead of a person. Perhaps it was simply the sight of her. Dottie was large, not soft, not delicate. Her shoulders were broad beneath a faded canvas dress that had been washed so many times the color had nearly vanished. Her arms were strong from years of hauling water and chopping wood. Dust clung to the hem of her skirt. Sweat darkened the cloth along her back. The sun fell hard across her face. Still, she stood straight. She did not hide. She did not plead. She did not lower her eyes to the wooden boards beneath her feet. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $1, he repeated. "Do I hear $1? No one answered. A few men shifted awkwardly. Someone muttered something under his breath. Another man chuckled quietly. Then, after several long seconds, Dottie spoke. $1. Her own voice, flat, calm. The words hung in the air. Then the crowd burst into laughter, not because the price was funny, but because a woman had just bid on herself as if she were the only one willing to claim her. At the far edge of the market, a man stopped walking. Jericho Kane had not intended to stay in Redemption Flats longer than it took to water his horse. He stood nearly a head taller than most of the men around him. Sun had darkened his skin to the deep bronze of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. A narrow scar ran from his left cheekbone down along the line of his jaw. His eyes were gray, cold gray, the color of desert sky before a storm. He had been crossing the square toward the well when the laughter reached him. He turned his head and saw her, a woman standing alone on a platform in the July sun, who had just offered $1 for herself and had not shed a single tear. Jericho watched her for a moment. He did not feel pity. A pity was cheap. What he saw instead was something rarer, dignity. The auctioneer lifted the hammer again. "Well then," he said lightly, still smiling from the crowd's laughter. $1 going once? $1,000. The voice came from the back of the crowd. The laughter stopped immediately. Jericho Kane stepped forward. $1,000, he repeated. The auctioneer blinked. Then he slammed the hammer down with sudden enthusiasm. "Sold!" A ripple of stunned whispers moved through the market. Jericho paid without bargaining. The contract was placed in his hand. Dottie climbed down from the platform slowly, her eyes studying him the way someone studies an unfamiliar trap. They walked a short distance away from the crowd. Jericho handed her the folded paper. Then he took a small matchbox from his pocket. The flame flared briefly in the wind. The contract caught fire. Paper curled and blackened until it collapsed into ash on the sand between them. Dottie watched it burn. Then she looked up at him. "What do you want?" Jericho closed the matchbox. 3 weeks, he said. "For what?" "Cooking." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "And after that?" "You go wherever you want." Beyond the market, the Arizona desert stretched westward in endless red earth and distant stone ridges. A long road, 2 strangers, and a future neither of them could yet see. The desert wind carried the laughter away, but it didn't carry her silence. "Before we ride farther into this story, tell me something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere quiet, or somewhere that still remembers dusty roads and small towns like Redemption Flats?" Dottie Marsh had been told most of her life that she was too much of everything people did not want. Too big, too strong, too noticeable in rooms where women were expected to fold themselves smaller. The Marsh family farm sat far outside Redemption Flats, where the land grew harsher and the soil thinner. Her parents had died within 2 years of each other when she was still young enough to remember their voices, but old enough to understand that the world had suddenly become colder. After that, the farm passed to her cousin, Virgil Marsh. Virgil liked to say he had taken responsibility for her. What he meant was that he had taken responsibility for the land and tolerated the girl who came with it. From the time Dottie was 14, she worked. Not the small, careful chores given to children. Real work. The kind that hardened hands and straightened backs. She hauled water barrels that most boys struggled to carry. She mended fences beneath the brutal summer sun. She rose before dawn to light the stove and slept after everyone else because the dishes still needed washing. At first, the townspeople praised her. Strong girl, they said, hard worker, but praise has a way of turning sour when it lasts too long. By the time she turned 20, the tone had changed. Too big to marry, some said. Too loud in a room. Too much appetite for a woman. Men who came by the farm looked past her the way they looked past tools leaning against a barn wall. Useful, but not desirable. Dottie learned something important during those years. Expectations were dangerous. If you hoped for kindness, disappointment would find you quickly. So she stopped hoping. She stopped crying too. The last time she had cried in front of Virgil, he had laughed and told her tears were wasted on someone built like a plow horse. After that day, she kept her feelings locked behind a quiet expression that rarely changed. But there was one thing she allowed herself: cooking. No one had formally taught her. The farm kitchen had simply been the one place she could work alone without Virgil hovering nearby. She began experimenting the way people experiment when they have nothing else that belongs to them. Different spices, different ways of slow cooking meat, different ways of baking bread so that the crust stayed firm while the inside remained soft. She noticed something. When a meal was good, people lingered longer at the table. Even Virgil, who rarely had patience for anything that did not earn him money, He stayed seated a few minutes more when the stew was rich enough. Food held people still, and for someone who had spent years being treated like extra weight in a room, the ability to make people stay carried a strange kind of quiet power. Hidden deep in her thoughts was a dream she never spoke aloud. Tucson. She had heard about a small cooking school there from a traveling merchant years ago. The man had described real kitchens, proper ovens, and teachers who showed students how to build flavors the way carpenters built houses. Since that day, the name Tucson had lived quietly in her mind, like a place on a distant map. She never told anyone. Dreams spoken too early had a habit of becoming jokes for other people. Jericho Kane had once believed in arriving on time. That belief ended 12 years earlier. Back then, he had already built a reputation as someone who could track men across country where most people lost trails within a mile. Ranchers hired him when cattle thieves disappeared into the desert. Town marshals hired him when fugitives slipped beyond their jurisdictions. He followed sign the way scholars read books, broken branches, shifted stones. The direction wind had moved dust across a footprint. One particular job had seemed simple. A man accused of murdering a ranch family had fled into the desert. Jericho followed the trail for 3 days across dry washes and narrow canyon paths. When he reached the ranch house, the door was open. The silence inside felt wrong. The killer had returned. Jericho arrived just after it happened. The family lay where they had fallen. The killer was already gone. No matter how fast he rode afterward, the trail never closed enough to catch him. That was the first time Jericho understood something about his work. Being close was not the same as being in time. After that, he changed. He stopped staying anywhere long enough for people to rely on him. When a job ended, he rode out before anyone could invite him to stay another week. He told himself it was practical. No attachments meant fewer complications. No one expecting you meant no one left waiting. So he moved through towns like passing weather, until the day he rode through Redemption Flats and heard a crowd laughing. He looked up and saw a woman standing on an auction platform under the Arizona sun, refusing to bow her head while the entire town treated her like property. Jericho Kane had spent years telling himself he did not interfere with things that were not part of his work. But something about that moment felt familiar. Not weakness, endurance, the kind the desert respected. And for the first time in a long while, Jericho did not keep riding. The first days at Jericho Kane's way station passed in quiet routine. The ranch sat 20 miles west of Redemption Flats, tucked against a low rise of red stone locals called Devil's Teeth. It was not a full cattle ranch, more a stopping place Jericho used between long rides. A small wooden house, a narrow barn, a water well, and a corral where tired horses could rest. The desert surrounded it on every side. Endless land, endless sky. The kind of place where people learned quickly that words were not always necessary. Dottie settled into work almost immediately. She rose before sunrise to start the stove and brew coffee strong enough to cut through desert mornings. She cooked simple meals, beans, biscuits, sometimes salted meat. Jericho kept stored for long journeys. When the cooking was done, she cleaned the small house, hauled water from the well, and helped with whatever work the ranch required. Jericho worked outside most of the day, repairing fence posts the wind had loosened, checking the hooves of the horses, patching leather straps on saddles worn thin by miles of travel. They spoke only when something needed saying. Coffee's ready. Storm might come tomorrow. Water bucket's empty again. The quiet between them was not awkward. Out here, silence belonged to the land as much as the wind or dust. But on the fifth day, something happened that finally broke that silence. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the kitchen window, filling the room with warm orange light. Dottie had just lifted a kettle of boiling water from the stove when her heel caught the edge of the wooden threshold. The kettle tipped. Most of the water splashed harmlessly onto the floor, but a narrow stream struck her wrist before she could pull away. The pain was sharp and immediate. She sucked in a breath, but did not cry out. Outside, Jericho heard the metal kettle hit the floor. He stepped into the kitchen. What happened? Nothing, she said automatically. Jericho looked at the water spreading across the boards. Then he looked at her wrist. The skin was already reddening. Let me see. It's fine. Dottie. It was the first time he had used her name. Something in the calm certainty of his voice made her pause. She extended her arm. Jericho took her wrist carefully. His hands were large and rough from years of rope burns and saddle leather, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. He examined the burn for a moment, then walked to a small cabinet and pulled out a tin. Bear grease. He spread a thin layer across the burn and wrapped her wrist with a strip of clean cloth. The kitchen grew quiet again. After a moment, Dottie asked the question she had been holding since the market. What do you actually do for a living? Jericho finished tying the cloth before answering. I track people. She studied him. For the law? Sometimes. And the rest of the time? He leaned lightly against the counter. Sometimes people hire me to find someone who disappeared. To bring them back? Sometimes. And sometimes? His gray eyes met hers. Sometimes they want to make sure that person never hurts anyone again. Dottie considered that for a moment. Then she asked another question. Have you killed someone? Yes. Her expression didn't change. Anyone innocent? Jericho paused. The pause was long enough to show the question mattered. No, he said finally, but I've arrived too late to stop innocent people from dying. For a moment, the desert wind pushed softly against the walls of the house. Dottie flexed her bandaged wrist. I think I understand that, she said quietly. Jericho studied her face. Then he nodded once toward the horizon outside the window. The desert doesn't measure a body, he said. It measures endurance. Out there, shape meant nothing. Size meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was who could keep moving when the road turned hard. Dottie looked toward the endless red land beyond the ranch. For the first time since arriving, a faint smile touched her lips. Life at the way station slowly found its rhythm. Morning in the Arizona desert began quietly. Before the sun climbed over the jagged red teeth of the eastern ridges, the air carried a brief coolness that disappeared almost as soon as daylight spread across the land. Jericho usually rose first. By the time the sky turned pale gold, he was already outside, drawing water from the well or walking the fence line that marked the edge of the property. The desert did not respect boundaries for long. Wind loosened posts, sand buried rails. A fence that stood strong 1 week could be half buried the next. Dottie woke soon after. The small kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and wood smoke as she stirred the morning fire back to life. She moved confidently through the space now, having memorized where everything rested. Flour sacks along the wall, iron pans hanging above the stove, dried herbs tied in bundles near the window where a narrow strip of sunlight reached each morning. They ate simple meals, eggs when Jericho had traded for them in town, beans and bread when supplies ran thin, thick coffee poured into chipped tin cups. After breakfast, the day unfolded into work. Dottie did not remain indoors the way many women might have in town. Once the dishes were cleaned, she stepped outside and joined whatever task needed doing. She carried water buckets from the well to the barn. She gathered fallen branches of mesquite for the stove. She swept dust from the porch that the desert insisted on reclaiming each afternoon. Jericho noticed something early on. She never complained. Not about the heat that pressed down by midday, not about the weight of the buckets, not about the constant dust that found its way into every corner of the house. Work seemed to settle her, rather than exhaust her. Toward the end of the first week, Jericho rode in with a young horse he had picked up from a nearby rancher who claimed the animal was too stubborn to saddle. The horse fought the reins the moment Jericho tried to secure the saddle. It jerked its head, stamping sharply in the dirt of the corral. Jericho kept his voice low, but the animal's nerves remained tight. Dottie stood nearby carrying a bundle of firewood. She watched for a moment. Then she set the wood down. "Mind if I try?" she asked. Jericho stepped back slightly. He didn't answer, but he opened the gate enough for her to enter the corral. Dottie approached the horse slowly, not directly. She circled slightly so the animal could see her coming. Her voice was soft, barely louder than the rustle of wind moving through dry grass. "Easy now," she murmured. The horse tossed its head once more, but did not pull away. Dottie placed a steady hand against its neck and waited, not pulling, not forcing, just standing there long enough for the horse to realize nothing dangerous was happening. After a minute, the tension drained from the animal's shoulders. With one smooth motion, she slipped the saddle across its back and tightened the strap. The horse stood quietly. Dottie stepped back out of the corral. "All set," she said simply. Jericho checked the strap. "Perfect." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The nod carried more respect than any compliment. Another afternoon, a supply wagon arrived from Redemption Flats. Two men climbed down from the driver's seat to unload sacks of flour, lamp oil, and a crate of tools Jericho had ordered weeks earlier. One of the men noticed Dottie immediately. His eyes moved slowly over her frame with a smirk that carried familiar cruelty. "Well now," he said loudly to his companion, "didn't know Kane hired someone that size for the kitchen." His partner laughed. Dottie lifted a sack of flour from the wagon without reacting. The man continued, "She cooking for an army in there?" Jericho had been standing near the well. He walked across the yard slowly until he stood beside the wagon. The laughter faded. Jericho's voice was calm. "Food she cooks feeds this place." He met the man's eyes. "That's enough." No anger, no raised voice, but something in the quiet certainty of his tone ended the conversation. The men finished unloading without another joke. When the wagon rolled away, the yard felt peaceful again. Dottie carried the last sack inside. Later that evening, she stepped onto the porch where Jericho sat, sharpening a knife. Neither mentioned what had happened. They didn't need to. Respect had already taken root between them. Evenings became the one time when the ranch truly rested. After dinner, the desert cooled quickly. The heat drained from the ground, replaced by soft wind that carried the dry scent of sage and dust. Jericho began sitting on the porch after meals. At first, Dottie stayed inside to finish cleaning. But after a few nights, she brought a second chair outside. They sat side by side beneath a sky so clear it seemed endless. Stars appeared one by one until the entire horizon glittered with cold light. Sometimes they talked about horses, about storms that rarely reached this far into the desert, about small towns Jericho had passed through during his years riding across Arizona. Other nights they said nothing at all. They simply listened, the wind moving across the land, the faint crackle of cooling earth after a day of heat, the distant cry of night animals somewhere beyond the ridges. In that quiet space, something began to grow between them. Not quickly, not dramatically. Respect came first. Respect for the way Dottie carried herself without asking for sympathy. Respect for the way Jericho treated her like an equal rather than a burden. Trust followed, the kind built slowly from shared work and long evenings under a wide desert sky. Neither of them spoke about it, but both of them felt it. The desert had a way of stripping people down to their true nature. And day by day, working side by side beneath that relentless sun, Jericho Kane and Dottie Marsh began to see each other clearly. Something deeper than companionship was beginning to form. Something quiet, something patient, something strong enough to survive the desert. The discovery happened on an ordinary afternoon. Nothing in the desert warned her that the moment would matter. Jericho had ridden out early that morning to check a line of cattle tracks crossing the northern flats. A rancher from 2 valleys away had mentioned stray animals wandering toward the ridge, and Jericho had agreed to look for them while he was already traveling that direction. By midday, the ranch sat unusually quiet. The wind moved slowly across the yard, pushing loose dust into thin spirals near the fence posts. Somewhere beyond the barn, a horse stamped lazily in the shade. Inside the house, Dottie moved through the kitchen with her usual calm rhythm. She had flour on her hands from kneading bread, and the smell of onions simmering in a pot filled the room. The small house felt almost peaceful when Jericho was away, though she couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was simply the quiet. Perhaps it was the strange realization that for the first time in years, she was working somewhere she had chosen to stay. She stepped into the front room to retrieve a sack of cornmeal from the supply crate near the door. Jericho's coat hung from the same nail where he always left it when returning from town. As she passed, something slipped from the inside pocket. A folded sheet of paper drifted down and landed softly on the wooden floor. Dottie paused. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Then she bent down and picked it up. Her first instinct was to return it without looking, but the weight of curiosity was difficult to ignore. She unfolded the paper slowly. Names, several of them, each written carefully in Jericho's steady handwriting. Next to every name were numbers, amounts of money, dates. Some names had small amounts beside them. Others carried rewards large enough to buy horses, land, or a decent house in town. It took her only a few seconds to understand what she was looking at. These were not supply lists. These were contracts. Men Being hunted. Dottie read down the page carefully. One name near the bottom stopped her breath. Virgil Marsh, her cousin, the man who had sold her labor contract in Redemption Flats. Next to his name was a number, $500. For a long moment, she did not move. The house felt suddenly smaller. Not dangerous, but heavier. She folded the paper carefully and slid it back into Jericho's coat pocket exactly as she had found it. Then she returned to the kitchen and finished preparing dinner. When Jericho returned near sunset, the sky was already beginning to fade into deep orange. Dust clung to his boots, and the horse he rode looked tired from the day's travel. Dottie set the plates on the table. They ate quietly, just as they had every evening since she arrived. Beans, bread, coffee poured into tin cups. But the silence tonight felt different. Not uncomfortable, just waiting. After the dishes were cleared and the lamp lit, Dottie placed both hands on the wooden table. "I saw the paper in your coat," she said. Jericho did not pretend to misunderstand. He simply looked at her. "My list," he said. "Yes." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she asked the question directly. "Is my name on it?" "No." The answer came immediately. She nodded once. "Is Virgil Marsh on it?" Jericho hesitated. It was not a long hesitation, but it was long enough. "Yes." The word sat heavily in the room. "My cousin," she said quietly. "I know." "You came to Redemption Flats looking for him." "Yes." Dottie studied his face carefully. "You could have used me," she said. Jericho did not interrupt. "You could have waited until I trusted you. Asked questions about where he might be hiding. Let me lead you to him." "Yes." "But you didn't." "No." "Why?" Jericho leaned back slightly in his chair. The lamplight flickered across the wooden walls of the house. "When I took the job," he said slowly, "Virgil Marsh was just another name." He paused. "After the market, he wasn't." Dottie said nothing. Jericho met her eyes. "You had already been treated like property once," he said. "I wasn't going to make that worse." Silence filled the room again. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the porch steps. After a moment, Dottie spoke. "You're still going after him?" "Yes." "Even if I ask you not to?" Jericho answered without hesitation. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." Another quiet moment passed. Then Jericho added something that surprised her. "I didn't want you involved." The honesty of the statement settled heavily in the room. For the first time since she had found the list, Dottie allowed herself to breathe more easily. Trust did not appear all at once, but in that moment, something inside her shifted. Jericho Kane was still hunting Virgil Marsh, but he had chosen not to use her as part of the hunt. And in the desert, where survival often depended on difficult choices, that decision mattered. It meant honor still had a place in the story. Virgil Marsh arrived at the ranch 3 days later. The afternoon had been quiet until then. Heat shimmered above the open ground, turning the distant ridges into wavering shapes along the horizon. Jericho had been repairing a loose saddle strap outside the barn, while Dottie worked inside, kneading dough for the evening bread. The sound of horses came first. Not 1, 3. Jericho looked up slowly. Across the desert road, 3 riders approached the way station in a line. Dust rose behind them in pale clouds that drifted slowly in the still air. Jericho already knew who it would be. Men like Virgil Marsh rarely ignored unfinished business. Dottie heard the horses too. She wiped the flour from her hands and stepped to the kitchen window. The moment she saw the lead rider, her chest tightened slightly, not with fear, but with the heavy familiarity of someone seeing a problem they had lived with too long. Virgil rode the same way he always had, loose in the saddle, one hand resting lazily on the horn, as if every road already belonged to him. Two men followed behind him, both armed, both wearing the careless confidence of men who believed numbers gave them an advantage. Jericho walked forward into the yard. He did not reach for the revolver at his hip. He simply waited. Virgil slowed his horse near the fence and smiled. "Well now," he said casually, "didn't expect to find you here, Kane?" Jericho didn't answer. Virgil's eyes drifted toward the house. "Heard an interesting story in Redemption Flats," he continued. "Something about a man paying $1,000 for a labor contract." Jericho remained still. "And I thought to myself," Virgil added, "that sounded like a mighty expensive way to borrow something that already belongs to me." The front door opened behind Jericho. Dottie stepped outside. The moment Virgil saw her, his smile widened. "There she is." He tilted his head slightly. "Family's been worried about you, Dottie." She walked forward until she stood beside Jericho. "I doubt that," she said calmly. Virgil gave a soft laugh. "You always did have a stubborn streak." His eyes moved across the yard. "Come on now," he said. "Let's not make this complicated. You ride back with me and we forget the whole thing." Dottie shook her head. "No." The word landed flat and steady in the desert air. Virgil's smile faded slightly. "You don't get to decide that." "I already did." Behind him, one of the men shifted his horse impatiently. Virgil's gaze moved toward Jericho again. "You planning to keep interfering in family business?" Jericho took one slow step forward. "This isn't family business." Virgil's hand drifted casually toward the revolver at his belt. "Careful," he said. "You might be forgetting how this works." Jericho's voice remained calm. "I know exactly how it works." The yard fell silent. Wind pushed dust across the ground between them. Then Jericho spoke the words that changed the balance of the moment. "I have your name on a bounty contract." Virgil froze. Jericho continued. $500, debt collection, failure to appear. The two riders behind Virgil exchanged uncertain glances. This was not what they had expected. Virgil looked at Jericho carefully now, not mocking anymore, calculating. "You planning to collect it?" he asked. Jericho met his gaze. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you ride away." The silence stretched across the yard. The desert had a way of making quiet moments feel enormous. Virgil understood the situation. Jericho Kane was not bluffing. A fight here would not end cleanly. After several seconds, Virgil gave a short, irritated laugh. "Well," he muttered, pulling his reins, "seems like today isn't worth the trouble." He turned his horse. The other two men followed quickly. Within moments, the riders were moving back toward the distant road. No gunfire, no fight. But the tension they left behind lingered long after they disappeared beyond the ridge. Jericho stood still for a moment, watching until they were gone. Then he exhaled slowly. Beside him, Dottie looked out over the empty desert. The wind moved softly through the grass again. The danger had passed, but the moment had changed something between them, something neither of them could ignore anymore. That night, the ranch felt different, not quieter than usual. The desert was always quiet after sunset, but heavier, as if the land itself understood that something important had happened during the day. Inside the small house, the oil lamp cast a soft amber glow across the wooden walls. The smell of bread and roasted beans still lingered faintly in the air after dinner. Dottie wiped the last plate dry and placed it carefully beside the others. Jericho remained seated at the table. That alone was unusual. For most of the past weeks, he had risen the moment the meal ended, stepping outside to check the horses or walking the perimeter of the ranch as if stillness made him uneasy. But tonight he stayed. His hands rested loosely on the table. The silence between them stretched for several seconds. Finally he spoke. "Dottie." She turned slightly. "Yes?" "You were never the problem." The sentence was simple, but it carried a weight that seemed to settle into the room itself. Dottie watched him carefully. "You don't know me," she said. There was no anger in her voice, only the quiet certainty of someone who had heard too many judgments from people who barely understood her. Jericho shook his head once. "I know enough." She leaned lightly against the back of the chair across from him. "What does that mean?" Jericho took a moment before answering. He was not a man who rushed words when they mattered. "It means I saw a woman stand on an auction platform in front of an entire town and refuse to bow her head." Dottie said nothing. "It means I watched you face the man who sold you and not take a step backward." The lamp flame flickered gently. "And it means," he continued, "that this is the first place I've sat at a table after dinner in years." That surprised her. Jericho let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "I usually leave the moment the work is done," he admitted. "Right out. Find the next job." "Why?" "Because staying somewhere long enough makes people start expecting you to stay." He looked up at her. "And this is the first time in a long while I didn't want to stand up and leave the chair." The honesty of that confession filled the small room. Dottie lowered her eyes briefly to the table. For years she had been told she took up too much space in the world. Too large, too loud, too difficult. Yet here sat a man who spoke as if her presence had done the opposite, as if it had given him a reason to remain still. Outside, the desert wind brushed softly across the porch. Inside the house, neither of them rushed to say anything more. Some truths did not need extra words. They only needed the courage to be spoken once. The third week ended quietly. No one marked the day on a calendar. There was no announcement, no moment when either of them stood up and said that the time Jericho had promised at the market was finished. But both of them knew. 3 weeks had passed. The agreement that had begun with a burning contract in the sand had reached its natural end. That evening, the desert cooled quickly after sunset. The sky above the ranch stretched dark and clear, filled with stars that seemed brighter the farther one moved from towns and lamplight. Jericho carried 2 wooden chairs onto the porch. He set them beside the railing where they could see the open land stretching west toward the distant ridges. Dottie joined him a few minutes later. For a while they sat without speaking, listening to the quiet sounds that always returned once the desert heat faded. Wind brushing through dry grass, a horse shifting in the corral, the faint creak of the porch boards beneath their boots. Finally, Dottie rested her hands on her knees and looked toward the horizon. "I've made up my mind," she said. Jericho turned his head slightly, but didn't interrupt. "I'm going to Tucson." The words came steady. "There's a cooking school there. Small place. I heard about it years ago." She paused briefly before continuing. I want to learn properly, not just the way I've been teaching myself." Jericho nodded once. "I figured." She looked at him. "You did? You cook like someone practicing for something bigger than a ranch kitchen." A faint smile appeared on her face. The wind shifted slightly, bringing the dry scent of sage across the porch. "For a long time," Dottie said slowly, "I thought if I ever left Redemption Flats, I'd have to do it alone." Jericho leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said calmly, "I suppose Tucson is where the road goes." She turned toward him. "That's not what I meant." "I know. You don't have to come. I know that too." The lantern beside the door flickered gently. Jericho looked out across the open desert for a moment before speaking again. "I've spent most of my life riding from one place to the next," he said. "Finishing jobs, leaving before anyone expected me to stay." His eyes shifted back toward her. "But sometimes the road changes direction." Dottie watched him carefully, not with suspicion, not with disbelief, with quiet understanding. Neither of them used the word love. It was too early for something that large. But the space between their chairs had grown smaller over the past weeks. Not forced, not rushed, just natural. Their shoulders nearly touched. Above them, the Arizona sky stretched endlessly, 1,000 stars scattered across the darkness. Somewhere beyond those miles of desert waited Tucson. A kitchen, a new beginning, and for the first time in many years, neither of them would be traveling that road alone. Morning returned to the desert the way it always did, quiet. The first light of dawn stretched across the open land, turning the red ridges pale gold and waking the dry grass with a faint whisper of wind. The way station looked the same as it had the day before. Barn, porch, well, and 2 saddled horses waiting near the fence. But something about it was no longer empty. Soon the road would lead south, toward Tucson, toward a small kitchen that did not yet exist, where flour would dust the counters and bread would rise in warm ovens, toward a place where a woman who had once been auctioned for $1 would cook meals people chose to stay for. And beside her, a man who had spent years riding away from every place he stopped, had finally learned how to remain. Not every story ends with a victory. Some end with something quieter. 2 people still there when the sun rises the next morning. Before we leave them under that wide Arizona sky, let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone who changed the direction of your road without even trying? Someone who simply stood beside you until the world felt a little less heavy? If a face just came to mind, then you understand exactly what Jericho saw that day in Redemption Flats.